Welcome to my channel, Delightful Stories. I'll be happy if you subscribe to my channel and like it. Enjoy watching and don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments about the story. The beginning of June this year turned out to be just fine. Pleasant. Not hot weather and trees blooming along the highway pleased the eye, and Willie nearly lifted the spirits of a young ambulance doctor en masse. Thomas, along with his assistants, Nurse Henry and driver Fred, were returning that day from a very difficult call. It was in a remote area in the States. An elderly woman had been attacked by her neighbor's dog and had been badly bitten by the poor pensioner. The most dangerous thing was that the dog, from all indications, was rabid. However, the stubborn owner flatly refused to put her to sleep. As a result, the doctors had to give the old lady a tetanus shot and sew up the serious lacerations on her legs and arms. Of course, they reported the patient to the proper authorities and prescribed a course of shots that the grandmother would have to take to the local hospital, but there was no other way. Fortunately, a relative who lived in the part of the area where the nearest clinic was located had agreed to take her in. Now all three were on their way back to town. The men were very tired, but nonetheless, they tried to keep each other's spirits up and keep their noses clean. Fred turned on the local radio louder, so that a pleasant melody would distract the physicians from their burdensome thoughts. Regarding the state of medicine, Henry, as usual, began at the end of the day to talk about his personal problems. Lately, not everything was going well in his family, so he often shared his concerns with his colleagues, whether they wanted it or not. This time he began to tell Thomas about his wife and mother-in-law who, as he understood from the nurse's stories, did not approve of his work in the ambulance. "What am I supposed to do?" Henry asked rhetorically. "I love my job, and I can't imagine myself in it anytime soon." And Lucy clamored, "Go to a private clinic. They pay more therapists. Go to the same old ladies who will be examined only for normal money, not for these pennies." And my mother-in-law went the same way. Henry looked sadly out the window. Is it my fault that she has never been to the sea since she was born? Well, we have no money to go to resorts now. We need to buy new curtains for the nursery. Some of the wallpaper came down after the last flood from the neighbors. We also need to change it, and it's all expenses, and not a small one at that. "Yes," shouted understanding driver. "Women, brother, they're like that. Put a finger in their mouth. You'll be without an arm up to your elbow in a jiffy. They'll bite you off before you have time to pull it out." Henry, encouraged by Fred's response, went on to complain to him about his loved ones. Thomas, meanwhile, quietly closed his eyes and thought. He, unlike the same nurse or driver, happily married for 20 years, there wasn't much to tell. For the past 5 years, Thomas had lived alone after his wife Fendi left him, worked as a paramedic, and had never thought of having a relationship with a woman. His own heart wound from the betrayal of his once beloved wife was too fresh, and he and Fendi had parted because of a banal adultery. Wife being an employee of a beauty salon, they met a wealthy suitor who soon lured her to his side with expensive gifts and enticing promises of a sweet life full of travel and various other pleasures. That his wife had left him. Thomas learned from the little note she had left for him in the kitchen. On returning one day, especially after a hard shift, the doctor found on the kitchen table a small scrap of paper where his wife had written just 2 sentences. "I am leaving you for a man who will be able to fulfill all my desires and make even my craziest dreams come true. Don't look for me, Thomas. Face it. It's hard to put into words all the pain and humiliation that your doctor felt then. That must have been what it feels like to have had an arm or a leg torn off. Victoria was literally everything to him. After living together for almost 5 years, Thomas could not imagine that she had been dissatisfied with him in any way, or that she had suffered because of his not so great salary. The betrayal, as well as the subsequent divorce, came as a real shock to the man. Such a betrayal he was unable to endure. So the first time after his wife left, he even drank. However, His colleagues very quickly repelled him, explaining that his life certainly does not end on the actions of one frivolous woman. "Don't kill yourself like that, Thomas," advised the head doctor where he worked. "You never know what some people have in mind." But it didn't work out with her. So what do you do now? Give up all the good in the world? Or maybe you should give up everything. So much in human life depends on you. Everyday ordinary people are waiting for your help, and there is no one to help them but you. Look on the bright side. One ungrateful fool abandoned you, but how many strangers will pray for your soul? Light a candle for you in church because you arrived there on time. And it's true, said he. That time Thomas was depressed. Except that I'll always have the pain here now. And the paramedic pointed to the chief physician's heart. Instead of answering, the chief physician patted his colleague on the shoulder with a comforting pat. "You're a good man," as they say, "and it will pass." He was right about something. It had been a long time, and only now was Thomas finally beginning to feel the dull pain in his chest begin to drain away. And yet it was the mental trauma that had long discouraged the paramedic from getting involved with women. He immersed himself in his work and soon realized that he came home only to spend the night. Strangely enough, Thomas even liked this way of life. He didn't have to answer to anyone for being late for dinner. No one had to give away his already small salary. Of course, there were disadvantages to living like almost no hot food in the evenings. But Thomas tried not to think about it. In any case, he was able to get over the separation from his wife, and now he tried with all his might to get on with his life as best he could. "Thomas." The nurse snapped his fingers in front of his face, fell asleep. "What's the matter?" Shook himself, immersed in his own thoughts, doctor. "We're here," said Mathey, not quite good-naturedly, turning the wheel to the right, "but we're not far away. You know, Henry was always asking about your attitude toward the credit," he said. "How does he feel about the family budget?" The driver gave a better chuckle and was about to change the radio station when suddenly he noticed that something very abruptly appeared on the road. A second later, Fred realized it was a human figure. "Holy crap," Fred managed to swear, and sharply turned the steering wheel to the opposite side, trying to dodge a collision. The car instantly went back to the left, which made Thomas and Henry have to grab onto the handrail inside the cabin with all their might. Thomas felt a strong jolt, after which the car finally braked. "Fred, are you okay?" asked Thomas, breathing heavily. "Yes, I'm fine," he answered, muffled. "Look how these junkies have lost their conscience. They already threw themselves under the wheels in broad daylight. Despite the fact that it was early evening, the road was clearly visible. That meant that Fred had no way of failing to notice the guy, and if he had accidentally decided to cross the highway in the wrong place. Thomas and Henry saw the body of a young man lying on the road. Judging by his tattered clothing and badly worn shoes, it was clear that he was a common vagrant. The doctors could not see his face for the wide, deep hood on the homeless man's head prevented them from doing so. "I told you, I must have been drunk or taken something stronger. So he decided to give me a lucky break here." Fred stared at the beggar's figure in discontent. Maybe he needed something? Maybe Thomas made another suggestion. Maybe he needs help, smirked the nurse. He needs to sober up. "We're not a cab service that picks up drunks and snitches on the road. What if he's crazy? Does that ever occur to you, Thomas?" The paramedic looked at his assistant with mute reproach. "I don't think people throw themselves under the wheels for the good life. Henry, it's our duty to help people. I'll go and see what's the matter with him. Eventually we'll drop him off at the hospital, and then we'll decide what to do with him." "That sounds like a bad idea to me, Thomas." The nurse shook his head in disapproval. "I think I'll stay in the car. Don't mind if I do. I have a family after all." The doctor said nothing and rushed out of the car to help the tramp. When he came closer, he saw that the homeless man, who'd apparently also fallen into some shock from his own action, had already begun to come to his senses. Cautiously approaching him, the paramedic pulled off his hood in one short movement. Beneath it was a young man of about 27 years of age. His curly hair was streaked across his face and stained with dirt and road dust. Later, 2 muddy tracks drew large tears. The young vagabond looked up at the doctor from below and suddenly threw himself on his knees before him, muttering in a voice hoarse with excitement as he went, "God, thank you for stopping. Thank you, I thought for sure no one would stop. Please help me, please." The unhappy man hugged Thomas's legs and pressed his tear, wet face against his belly. "How can I help you?" the doctor asked him gently. He unhooked his arms from his legs. "Can you explain exactly what happened to you?" The stranger nodded and struggled to rise from the foam track. I just don't know what to do. I've never encountered anything like this before. Come with me, I'll show you." Thomas was touched by the sincerity with which the beggar tried to draw the attention of the medics to himself. In fact, he had almost sacrificed his own life to stop the ambulance rushing toward him. The tramp held out his hand to the paramedic and pointed with a nod behind him toward the wooded area. "There is not much time." The doctor looked at the homeless man with some doubt, but nevertheless agreed and followed him. "You'd better be careful with that madman, Thomas," he heard Henry shout behind him. "Who knows what those bums have in mind?" Maybe Thomas did not pay much attention to what his assistant said, though he knew that to some extent he might be right. But it was also a little reassuring for Henry himself. He did not notice any signs of intoxication or use of any illegal substances on the tramp. The unfortunate homeless man looked extremely anxious, one might even say desperate, but no more. After walking a few dozen meters in a corner of the forest, the homeless man led the doctor to a small open clearing in the middle of the forest. Thomas was astonished to see a pregnant woman writhing in pain. "But that's news to me." The paramedic was stunned. "When did you find her in this condition?" he asked the man. "Half an hour ago." The man excused himself. "I honestly did not know what to do about it. She screamed so hard at first, but it just came out, and now she seems to have calmed down." The woman in labor was holding her stomach and making moans and noisy noises at the same time. From the looks of it, the poor woman had been in labor for a long time. She had to act immediately. "I see. So, are you going to help me now?" "I'll call someone else to help," the doctor said decisively and took out his miniature walkie-talkie with the help of which his colleagues could communicate with each other. "Henry, can you hear me?" the paramedic shouted into the radio. "Get over here quick. I've got a woman about to give birth. They say they heard a muffled mechanical noise at first, and then the nurse's hurried reply. I'm on my way. Thomas, let me just find my suitcase. He's been dumped somewhere since our emergency stop. I don't give a damn about the case." Thomas shouted at him, "Just carry yourself. We've got to get her to the car. We'll never make it out of here alone." He mumbled something incomprehensible, and then the radio went silent. "What a weirdo," muttered the paramedic to himself. Maybe Lucy was right when she advised him to go to a private clinic and not to think too much. Everything is quiet. Everything is simple. Thomas's musings were interrupted by another tone of voice from a woman in labor. The woman shuddered with excruciating convulsions, and the paramedic gingerly groped her abdomen. His hunch was correct. The woman was about to give birth, so the situation was becoming more and more critical with each minute that passed in the delay. In addition, the doctor's gut feeling told him that there was clearly something wrong with the baby. Maybe he was even walking on his feet. "Do you even know who that is?" Thomas asked the homeless man. The young man's eyes filled with genuine fear. He clasped his hands together and tried to explain, except he was hampered by a severe stutter. "No, not at all." He spoke slowly. "I was just passing by picking mushrooms. I thought I'd roast them on the fire tonight." "Do you always stutter when you're nervous?" Thomas asked, more out of habit than pure interest. The stranger just nodded. Yes, I had it in my childhood. The boy took a deep breath to calm down and then continued more clearly. I had nothing to do with it. I swear. I was picking mushrooms. I heard somebody moaning. Well, I went to the voice and found her and almost fainted when I saw that. Why didn't you call an ambulance? Thomas said, watching the woman's breathing. Why did I have a phone? That's why I ran out on the road. I was hoping I could at least stop someone. Luckily you were passing by. Not a single car stopped before that. No matter what I did. The laboring woman, on the other hand, didn't seem to see anyone or anything anymore. She fell into a kind of birth trance, when the consciousness behind the fog swirls to the point where the woman is not even aware of where she is now or what is happening to her. Thomas gently patted her cheeks to keep her from passing out. No, honey, hold on. Now you and I are going to the hospital and everything will be okay. Where the hell is Henry? It was at that moment that a nurse suddenly jumped out of the bushes behind the men. I'm here, Thomas. What have we got here? Henry's eyes widened in amazement. I didn't think it was that bad. Where the hell have you been? The doctor shouted angrily at him. Do you want her to die in our arms with the baby? Get her up by her feet now and I'll take her head. What should I do? The homeless man asked timidly. And you hold her by the waist. Thomas nodded briefly at the woman in labor. See how big her belly is. There will be a lot of sagging in the hotel section. You never know if the spine might not hold. Under fear, with great difficulty, all three carried the unfortunate woman to the ambulance. She, being semi-conscious, was only writhing in her pain. Fred touched her quickly, shouted Thomas to the driver. Got it. I don't have to tell you twice. He nodded and turned the ignition key in the well. What are you looking at? Get in the car, shouted Thomas to the homeless man. May I? With excitement, he asked. Let's give us a hand if you need it. The beggar deftly jumped into the car. And so they drove off. Unfortunately, the men never made it to the maternity ward. The labor began in the car and was accompanied by great blood loss on the part of the young mother. Thomas somehow managed to bring the laboring mother to her senses and get her to breathe properly. However, just as the doctor guessed, he also had to turn both fetuses inside the woman manually. They were twins. Though he tried to do it as carefully as possible, he didn't succeed without rupturing it. When the stranger finally gave birth to the babies, she lost consciousness almost immediately. Wrapping the tiny babies in the form of fingers, Thomas passed the twins into the hands of a tramp. God, this is so amazing, he muttered, stammering, while he was smiling ear to ear. Needless to say, the boy had never seen a birth before in his life. Take it. Their mother is in a terrible condition. She can't be nursing. She'd better get her to a hospital alive. And you're a kind of godfather to these little ones now. And if it weren't for you, she would have surely died out there in the woods. Henry, who was also actively involved in helping the baby girl, only hummed. Yes, of course. You could forget about my almost 200 hours of assisting here. That makes sense. I mean, we got some random star tonight. Shame on you, Henry. Thomas asked him earnestly. Is it a question of someone's merits now? The main thing is that we saved the mother and the children. You see, the mother and the children. All the rest is of no concern to you at all. The homeless guy was only embarrassed and held the newborns tighter to him. It was a boy and a girl. Somehow the homeless man felt such warmth toward these strange children, as if they were his own. What's your name? Thomas asked him in surprise. Oh, that's right. I didn't have time to introduce myself to you. The homeless man apologized to the paramedic. Kevin, my name is Kevin. Thomas looked at him with a smile, and then said, ignoring Henry's jealous stance, Well, Kevin, you were a hero today. No matter what anyone says, it's not something anyone would dare do, and if it were you, someone else would have quit. but you risked your life. You're a good man, Kevin." The beggar's cheeks flushed faintly. It had been a long time since he had heard such nice things said to him. After they brought the woman and her children to the hospital, the young mother was immediately sent to the intensive care unit, and the children were placed under the supervision of doctors on the ward. Exhaling a little, Kevin walked out onto the hospital porch and took a seat on a bench. The boy presented a sunbeam to his face and slowly took a series of calming breaths and exhaled. He was very much afraid that from the excitement he would not be able to string 2 words together properly in case any more help was needed from him. After a while, Thomas appeared on the doorstep of the clinic. He was paler than usual and sank slowly onto a bench beside the homeless man. "Thomas, are you all right?" the boy asked him. The paramedic seemed to him to be upset about something. "I wouldn't say so," Thomas answered him grimly. "And please, just call me Thomas. I'm not much older than you are." "Okay." The boy nodded. "How's that woman feeling?" "She's better now." The paramedic just sighed deeply. "That's just it, Thomas. She's in a very serious condition right now. She's lost a lot of blood. She needs a transfusion. Otherwise, it might end very badly." "So, what's the problem?" The homeless man frowned. "Is there no blood for one poor woman in such a huge hospital?" Thomas grinned bitterly. "There is blood, but it's not that simple." He was silent for a while, trying to get his thoughts together. "You see, rhesus groups are not very rare. Fourth positive. Such a group, and even in a cube, positive resource is very difficult to find. As it turns out, we just don't have a sample like that in our clinic." "What's going to happen to her now?" With undisguised concern for the life of the laboring woman, asked Kevin. "Can you really let her die after all she went through on the way here?" The doctor looked at him with sincere regret, but so far she is in a coma. "But the situation is very serious. Every hour could cost." "God, that's so amazing." "Now the doctors are doing everything they can." The man folded his arms across his chest. "I wanted to give my own blood, but it doesn't fit at all. Not only that, the wrong type can only hurt." And then the paramedic suddenly looked at the homeless man, and his attentive gray eyes slipped a tiny ray of hope mixed with the blackest despair. "Listen, Kevin, what blood type are you?" The boy shrugged his shoulders at a loss. "Yeah, to be honest, I don't know either. I'm an orphan. I am an orphan. I haven't been to a hospital since I was a kid. At the orphanage, we were only seen by a doctor when something serious happened. If someone was sick or if we got hurt in a fight. I remember that we got basic vaccinations that were in the certificate. There was nothing else. I ran away from the orphanage a couple of years before I graduated and couldn't live there anymore. Since then, I haven't been able to get anywhere in my life. Now I exist as best I can." Thomas looked at him with some disappointment, but just in case he asked, "You know, I'm not sure there's anything else we can do for her, but you should get a blood type test and find out for yourself." Interesting, right? And then in life, anything can happen. It's better to know your blood type beforehand so you don't lose precious time. He reluctantly agreed. He was willing to take the test, but he was not too happy about pricking his own fingers. The thing was, he had hated needles and knives since he was a child. The boys at the orphanage had once tried to hang him with a homemade blade for fun, and the impression of this nearly tragic experience was permanently ingrained in the young beggar's mind. Still, for the possible salvation of that stranger, out of respect for the paramedic, the homeless man made his way to the office where he could take a quick blood type test. Less than half an hour later, the examiner ran out of the office. "Astonishing news, Thomas." "Bingo. This young man has the right blood type. Even his rhesus is just as positive." The paramedic's face instantly brightened. "That can't be true." "Are you sure?" "Well, my dear, science never lies. It matters," the man assured me. "God, this really is wonderful news." Thomas muttered, and hurried to dial the number of the surgeon who had laid the woman in labor on his cell phone. Kevin, who'd been sitting next to the room the whole time, asked astonishedly, "So my blood fits. We can save her." "I am absolutely sure of it," the expert assured him. "In addition, young man, I have this suspicion that you and this patient may well be blood relatives." Kevin, as he sat on the bench, froze and was surprised by such a statement. The young tramp spoke slowly. He even stopped stammering at the very suggestion of such a thought. "Are we related to him?" "But no, doctor, it cannot be so. You could see by her that she was of the rich, and she was wearing nice clothes and perfume. And who am I? Just a bum from the street who grew up in an orphanage. No, that can't be right." Yeah, the expert agreed with the guy. "This really is an amazing case. It's been a long time since we had such a Santa Barbara here." The doctor smiled, but then said, "Of course, it's your right to take or not to take the kinship test. No one will force you to take it. However, Thomas himself seemed really interested in the case. I'll already talk to the doctor about your blood, Kevin. We have to start the transfusion immediately if we want to save her. But that doctor's right. You have nothing to lose by giving us samples to test. Believe me, I've been working in the ER for almost 15 years. This is the first time I've seen a case like yours. What if you and this young mother are really related to each other? Haven't you ever wanted to know about your real family?" Shocked, Kevin wondered again. The very possibility of such a thing was negligible, but his heart was instantly enveloped in a pleasant warmth. After all, if this woman was his sister, then it appeared that her children were his little nephews. But was that possible for a man who had spent half his adult life on the streets in China and in basements and dumpsters, eating at best a couple of meals a week in soup kitchens for homeless people like him? Kevin had long considered himself a lost soul with nothing good to look forward to in this life. "All right, I agree," nodded at last the tramp. "Just let me give her my blood first." The transfusion went smoothly, and there too, Kevin donated samples to be matched with the DNA of the woman found in the woods. A few hours later, the expert confirmed Thomas's theory and his own. A homeless guy, a woman in labor from the woods, a brother and sister. And not just any brother, but twins. That's why our mommy gave birth to twins. That's why our mommy gave birth to twins. Kevin happily explained to the doctor. It is not uncommon in families who have already had twins. "Congratulations, you have found your family member." Kevin was in complete shock. He couldn't believe his ears when he heard that. He had a sister. It was only now that the young beggar began to remember that the woman who had given birth in the ambulance had the same curly, dark blonde hair as himself. Their eyes seemed to be the same too, light green, like the first grass in the spring. Thomas, being a man of normal values, also congratulated the young homeless man. "Well, Kevin, congratulations. You got a sister and nephews too. Isn't that a blessing?" Thomas shook hands firmly with the bewildered tramp. In a way, he and Kevin could now be regarded as buddies, since they had both taken part in saving lives. Thomas felt Kevin was a man, a very good man. Only life was hard for him. I wish he had such a partner to take over for him. Not like that everlasting, but also the late Henry. "That's very nice, of course," said Kevin, struck to the core. "But how did my sister end up in such a difficult position in the woods, and all alone? That's a question we have yet to find out." "I agree," the paramedic nodded. "You and I can't know anything now, as long as she stays in a coma. When she comes to, the truth will come out. Don't worry, the most important thing now is to look after her kids so they'll be all right. You want your nephews to be healthy and strong, don't you?" Kevin nodded. Though it was hard for him to accept the truth, the fact remained. As long as his sister remained in a coma, Kevin's own main task was to provide his little nephews with everything they needed, and he would do everything he could for that from his side. 2 weeks passed. The baby girl, who, as it turned out, was named Sally, was still in a coma. Kevin came to see her almost every day, furtively observing her sister through the glass, and then walking to the ward where his little nephews were being held. The doctors looked after the babies there, and Thomas visited occasionally. The babies were on artificial nutrition, so the nurse did his best to get them all the necessary formula and medicines. Kevin himself, as promised, did everything he could to help his sister and her children. The boy was scavenging the dumps, scrap metal, and deliver it to a collection point. He did the same with bottles and other glassware for which he could make a small fortune. Thomas, seeing the young man's eagerness, took pity on him and invited him to stay with him for a while. "Come on," rejected at first Kevin. "That's the joy of having a stranger's man under your roof. I'll do it on my own. I've been on the streets for years. What's your family gonna say? They wouldn't want you living next door to them." Thomas smiled at the boy, though his eyes grew sad for a moment. "Don't be absurd, Kevin. Don't talk nonsense, Kevin. First of all, you don't embarrass me with your presence, especially since I only come home to sleep and bathe. And as for the family, I live alone, so you're not to worry at all." The homeless man looked at his benefactor strangely. Of course, he guessed that the paramedic must have had something in the past that caused him to live in complete loneliness. But it was not in Kevin's habit to pry into other people's hearts, so he said nothing to him about it and only thanked him. "Well, if you're sure that you and I are going to live together, thank you from the bottom of my heart. In fact, I'm a non-conflictive person about the safety of things, you can rest assured. I never took anyone else's things, even when I lived in an orphanage. So I don't plan to start. Believe me, that's the last thing I'd think of you," he assured him. "A man like you, of that I'm quite sure, would never do anything illegal, I'm sorry. But I've always had a good instinct for such things. You literally have it written all over your face that you're a law-abiding citizen." Kevin laughed heartily. "I didn't know. I guess I'd have to switch to something more serious than vagrancy." Kevin knew he couldn't spend the rest of his life wandering the streets. As long as I had talent in that area, as you say, he should get some kind of education and start living a normal life. But how could he do that, when in fact he was still a man with no past and no future? To be honest, he had never even had a passport. It so happened that God took mercy, and he managed to slip past the police unnoticed. Deep down, the guy sincerely wanted to get on the right track, but had absolutely no idea how to go about it to begin with. When Thomas brought him to his place, Kevin, he felt as if he had entered a real paradise. Not only did the paramedic give him an entire room where he could sleep on a real bed, but he also had hot water and a real bathroom. For the first time in weeks, the homeless man had a human bath. The sun was shining on his soul at that moment. "For dinner, sorry, just dumplings," Thomas shared as he dipped the ice bears into the boiling water. "But I think with butter and black pepper they'll be quite edible." Kevin, by then, having changed into the clean clothes Thomas had given him, only cautiously sat down on a chair in the kitchen and said embarrassedly, "If you knew how many years I haven't had dumplings, you'd be very surprised." "Really?" The doctor interrogated in amazement. "Well, now you're going to try it. Dumplings are the best food for our brother doctor." "I am not worthy of all this," said the boy suddenly. "Everything in your kindness and Sally, who happens to be my own sister. Honestly, sometimes I don't even believe that. Everything that is happening around me at this moment is real. It seems that in a little while I will wake up and it will turn out that this is just some colorful, amazing dream. And I'm actually lying under a bridge somewhere, dying of cold and hunger." Tears glistened in Kevin's eyes, and he tried to brush them away, but he couldn't. Everything he had accumulated in his soul over the years of wandering suddenly burst out, like a river that suddenly broke its banks. "Calm down, Kevin. Don't." Thomas tried to cheer him up. I know this isn't easy for you. So much information is overwhelming, but take a moment to think about the fact that this might be your chance to change your life completely. Maybe it's time to start your new journey towards something bigger, something that can fill your destiny with new experiences and meaning. The crying guest touched the paramedic to the core. The man realized now, no matter what happened, he wouldn't leave Kevin without support, wouldn't let this guy get lost. You know, I also had a moment in my life when I honestly thought that I was done, that I would never be able to move on. But good people told me in time that if I gave up even for a second, even for a moment, I risked losing everything I still had. So Thomas told me about his unfaithful wife. Kevin was amazed at how simply and at the same time sneakily Wendy had betrayed the air doctor. He understood Thomas's feelings well, even though he himself had never had a serious relationship. When you're just a guy off the street, what do you have to offer? A normal, nice girl. And Kevin didn't want to get involved with all the frivolous girls from the brothels and gangs of the city. Deep down, he dreamed of true love and a nice big family, which he no longer hoped to find. I'll help you, the paramedic promised him. I don't know how, but I will. You just set yourself a goal. What would you like to be in this life? What would you like to be in this life? What would you like to be now that you have people close to you, and we'll figure something out? Thank you, Thomas. Kevin thanked him with tears in his eyes. You're the first person in my memory who's ever shown me such kindness and compassion as a human being. I'll never forget it, I promise you. The men sealed their promise with a firm handshake, and from that moment on they became true friends. Another week passed. Thomas worked in the ambulance as before, and Kevin did all kinds of part-time work that only he was hired to do. He started unloading boxes and sweeping the front of stores. In short, he did all sorts of odd jobs. In the meantime, Sally, who was still in a coma, had a strange visitor. Thomas, who at that moment just arrived from another call, witnessed a strange conversation between this stranger and the attending physician of the recently delivered baby. "Excuse me, can you tell me, how is Sally feeling now?" asked the man in response, to which he received a frown from the surgeon. "And you, what were you to her?" he asked. Thomas noticed how the eyes of the strange visitor of the clinic began to run. The flowers he was holding in his hands immediately shook, and a few petals poured out of them on the coffee floor. "I am her husband, he finally said. "You just tell me, can I go to her? I hope she and my children are all right." Thomas couldn't explain it himself, but something in the strange man's voice made him suspicious. He had spoken hastily of his marriage, as if he had not considered it a serious matter. And he never gave his name. "Husband, then?" The surgeon looked at him sternly. "And why did not you come right away when we brought your wife with such a terrible loss of blood? Do you realize that she could not only lose her children, but also to death? If by some miracle and in time we had not picked up for her, so she needs the blood she needs." "I'm sorry, why are you talking to me like that?" The man wanted to be indignant, but at that moment, Thomas decided to figure things out for himself. He approached the stranger from behind and gently touched his shoulder. "Excuse me, I delivered your wife's baby, but I would like to know your name first," Thomas said. At the same moment, the man with the flowers turned around and looked at the paramedic with his cloudy, slightly insane eyes. What did you say?" he asked again. But when he looked into the doctor's face, he went as pale as a sheet. His hands trembled helplessly, dropped the humble bouquet on the floor. In the next instant, his face creased and his lips folded as if he were about to burst into tears. On top of that, Thomas also smelled a strong odor of strong alcohol coming from the stranger. "Man," Thomas began again, but the man let out a truly bestial groan and collapsed to the floor. After that, emitting horrible cries, the stranger literally crawled away from the paramedic, pushing off the floor with his shaking legs and muttering to himself in a fit of madness. No, it can't be. You can't. God, can you help it? Muttered Thomas anxiously. But all he heard in response was inaudible shrieks. Stay away from me. Get away from me. David, I killed you. I'll kill you. You can't be here. There is no you. You're a dead man, and dead men don't walk around hospitals. Realizing that the stranger had obviously completely lost control of himself, if not all his sanity. All in all, the paramedic decided to enlist the help of specialists. Nurse, come here quickly. The man is sick here, needs a sedative, and fast. The nurse jumped up almost immediately, at the same time bringing a couple of stronger orderlies with her. Together they gave the stranger the cherished injection, and then carried him to his room so that he could rest and come to his senses. Look at that, another drunk as hell, said a disgruntled surgeon. But he looked like a decent man and has a nice car in front of the clinic, probably some businessman. But what is he doing to his wife? So much time had passed and not a word from him. He's only just now showing up when his wife's lying in a coma between life and death. Yes, it's strange, Thomas answered him. As soon as the surgeon left, he quietly called the police. After explaining the situation, he immediately heard the answer of the investigator, to whom he was rather quickly transferred. That it wasn't Baker himself who showed up. What did you say the name of the victim was? Thomas, can I ask you to stay at the hospital until we get there? Your presence is very important to us. Of course I'll wait, Thomas agreed. Tell me, is Sally's life not in danger while she's in our hospital? I don't think so, replied the investigator. But just in case, we'll send a man to guard her room until we get there. You will do your best, but you must keep the scoundrel busy as long as you can. He's coming, and he's coming. That was all the ambulance doctor could answer, after which he and the investigator hung up. The police, who arrived sometime later, were able to shed some light on the strange behavior of their mysterious visitor. With the paramedic and surgeon in an empty room, the investigator began his story. This fellow is not Sally's husband at all. Her husband died about 7 months ago, supposedly shot in a picnic organized by your temporary patient, Roy Baker, who now sits locked up in the room next door to us as no one else, as her husband's business companion. They were both involved in gold mining in the north of the country. So Baker decided to take over his partner's business quietly. The investigator grinned and adjusted his tie before continuing. Your instincts, Thomas, turned out to be excellent. We've been watching this scoundrel for months now. From the beginning we suspected he'd shot her husband, but we didn't have any evidence. A search of the scene yielded nothing either. We never found the casings from the gun. For a very long time, we didn't even know what type of weapon the businessman had been killed with. Until one day, we decided to visit his hunting cabin, located in the vicinity of the area where the crime had taken place. So what kept you from doing it in the first place? You have no idea how clever a manipulator he turned out to be, said the inspector. You wouldn't believe it. He even managed to fool the lie detector. In addition, Roy assured us that he did not know how to shoot. And he said that his firearms collection was a keepsake from his father. It's kind of like his father collected different guns. It was then the ballistics expert was able to determine that the tracer only knew the effort it took to do it. The doctor was indignant. It was literally a lottery. Luck or no luck? The investigator shrugged his shoulders and then turned his gaze back to the paramedic. By the way, you look very much like her husband here, he said, and shook his head. The resemblance is striking. Your late companion must have seen you in your drunken voice. He'd gone to ground as soon as he smelled something fishy, hadn't he? In one remote village, we were on the trail of him. Only because the local saleswoman confirmed that for a couple of weeks there's a regular sale of several bottles of vodka to a very good this gentleman. He must have felt guilty about what he had done, so he decided to drink himself into a semi-conscious state, and then came here to risk it. After all, he came out of his energy to find out if his money barrel had survived. What do you mean? The surgeon didn't understand. But how? Sally remains the rightful heiress to her husband. All of the company's assets, as well as her husband's entire fortune, will go to her and their children together. She, by the way, has complained to us several times about harassment by Roy. We even had guards assigned to her. But that cunning fox knew his business very well. He didn't touch her for the time being. So he wanted to marry her too, to get access to the money of the rod? Thomas asked. I can guess. Quite right, nodded the investigator. Such a simple but effective way to get what you want. Fortunately, Sally immediately realized that the courtship of Roy had only one purpose. We checked the CT the day she was in the woods, and you brought her to the hospital, not arguing heatedly with the suspect in her house. Then she just ran away. She probably just got lost in the woods, understood the surgeon. And then the stress contraction started. It all made more or less sense now. That's fine, the policeman nodded. When Sally comes to, I'll go and see her again if you don't mind. I shall have to hear her side of the story and take her statement. That won't happen until she's out of her coma and fully recovered. The surgeon warned him. Give me some time, please. There's still so much that can happen in this woman's life. Let's not bombard her with such a powerful flow of information. The attending doctor glanced at Thomas, who understood what he was talking about. They had yet to tell her about their own brother who had found him after all these years. Absolutely, I understand, the policeman replied. Just let me know when I can get to her. It won't take long, I promise. After the police left and took Roy with them, Thomas called Kevin and asked him to meet him. When he arrived at the hospital park, the paramedic was already waiting for him and told the guy everything he had just learned himself. My God. And I never would have imagined that my little sister could have such a tragic fate. How could it be? She's a widow and her children are orphans. Of course not, said Thomas firmly. She has a caring, loving brother like you. And I'll help in any way I can, of course. Sally won't be left alone and her children won't grow up without a father. After all, if his nephews need it, you can replace them. True enough, the homeless man agreed. I only wish Sally would come to her senses sooner. I can't wait to tell you about myself. Although I myself am very scared, I didn't even know I had a sister at the orphanage. The teachers never told me about it. I remembered it later on purpose, when it all came out. The paramedic cheerfully patted him on the shoulder. Don't worry, buddy. It's going to get better. You'll see, Thomas smiled at his younger companion, who offered him an invitation to visit his nephews together. You wouldn't believe it. I was there only yesterday, and I missed them like I hadn't seen them in a month. I wonder what my sister will call them. Have you thought of names yet? Thomas asked. I have some in mind, said an embarrassed Kevin, but I can't just name them. It is my mother's prerogative, after all. Besides, she and her husband must have had plans of their own. Who am I to make these decisions alone? Well, you're supposed to be a humble uncle, Thomas laughed. But you're right. Let's wait for Sally's reaction. Who knows, maybe she'll listen to your opinion. After another week, she finally came to her senses. The first thing the woman said was, the kids, the babies. What's the matter with them? Quiet, please calm down. The surgeon who came to the scene told her, there is nothing wrong with your children. The boy and girl are 2 and 2.5 pounds. All within normal limits accordingly. Thank goodness, said Sally with relief. Tell me, when I can see them, can I feed them myself? Sure you can, smiled the doctor. But first, let's you and I recover, put ourselves back in order. You've been in a coma for almost a month. The woman opened her eyes wide and tried to sit up, but severe dizziness prevented her from doing so. Relax already, all right. The doctor gently stroked her on the arm. You were brought here in an extremely serious condition. Thank God you have come to your senses. Back to your children. All you need to do now is to rest and eat plenty of food. Then you'll be able to take care of your children. Head physician of the hospital did not want to shock Sally. the news of her late husband's companion's arrest, and the sudden discovery of her marriage. He and the paramedic feared that if they told her everything at once, the woman's still weak body simply would not be able to cope. Instead, Thomas volunteered to personally investigate why Sally had been separated from Kevin at an early age. Thanks to the help of an investigator who dealt with the case of the wife of a businessman, Paramedic 3 was able to find out that initially in the orphanage, where most of his childhood spent his youth, Kevin planted two little twins. However, a couple of months later, the girl, who was Sally, was adopted by a wealthy childless couple, while little Kevin had to spend many years alone in the orphanage. It was not known why the wealthy couple did not take both babies at once, but the fact remained. Sally became a wealthy heiress, and Kevin became a homeless vagabond who had almost finally fallen into the social abyss of poverty. Gradually, when Sally was strong enough to know all that had happened, the surgeon introduced her first to Thomas, who quietly brought the distraught and worried Kevin into the room with him. "Thomas, I realize that my gratitude to you cannot be expressed in any material equivalent," Sally began. "But you know, if you ever need anything at all, you can always come to me. You're the man who not only saved my children, but also allowed me to be a living reminder of what human kindness and participation can do." She was nursing her glorious children in her arms, and she couldn't help but to break into a few big tears at that moment. "I'm sorry now." She spoke so emotionally, smiling. "Nothing." The paramedic answered her good-naturedly. "For me, the most important thing is that you are alive, and your children can now live with a healthy and happy mother. But I would like you to meet someone too." Thomas pointed to Kevin, who was blushing with embarrassment and was sitting on a chair near the door and was grieving, despite his tall stature. It was as if he were dreaming of becoming invisible at that moment. "Kevin, my brother," exclaimed Sally, stunned to the core when she learned the whole truth about the boy. "God, but how is that possible? My parents told me I was adopted, but they never mentioned that there were two of us. God, Kevin, you poor thing, you've been in that orphanage your whole life, and then on the streets, all because of me." No. The tramp hurried to reassure her nervous sister. "Please don't worry. What's that got to do with you? Who knows what your parents' motives were? Maybe they couldn't afford to raise both of us back then." "I'm just happy to be able to talk to you now. And of course, I'm thankful to heaven that they brought me to that clearing that day to help you. Though hand on heart, Thomas did all the work here. He was the one who saved you and gave my nephew's life. I was just the backup." Sally looked at Thomas, and her cheeks flushed proudly with a beautiful, softly pink blush. He was very much like her husband and also turned out to be such a wonderful man. In her heart, the young woman felt a long-forgotten feeling. "Sally, I wanted to ask you if it is possible." Kevin stuttered a little. "May I see Sam and Lily at least sometimes? You see, I got so attached to them while you were but unconscious." "What are you talking about, of course?" Sally exclaimed, smiling. "Kevin, you realize that after my husband's death, I became all alone. It's a miracle to have you in my life, to have children. How can I deprive you of visiting the twins when I literally owe you my life? And Thomas will always be welcome in our home. Guest. Isn't that right, Thomas? Will you let me call you that?" Thomas was mesmerized by the reunion scene, brother and sister. He didn't even realize right away that it was him he was talking about. The man looked embarrassed and said, "Yes, if you do not mind, I'm only happy. Especially at the beginning, I'll still need to come to you a couple of times to check the status. So we will meet again anyway." Just before Sally was discharged, the investigator stopped by and recorded all her statements concerning Roy. Indeed, just as the policeman had said, he urged her to marry him. But the woman was well aware that her late husband's companion only wanted her money and custody of her minor children. Realizing what this could do to her family, she ran away from home, hoping to seek asylum at the local police station. However, in a fit of emotion, she forgot the shortcut leading directly through the woods and got lost. A couple of months later, Sally offered to help Kevin with further education and housing. The young woman persuaded the boy to move into her mansion, but he refused, explaining that more than anything else he wanted to live in his own apartment and help them financially like a real man. Kevin's papers were restored, and he, strangely enough, decided to catch up on his schoolwork and then enroll in medical school as a nurse. That way, he wanted to do as much good for people as possible. But realizing that the level of his basic education was not yet enough, he decided to start small. Thomas and Sally started dating soon after. Thomas, who had already come to love her children as his own, became an excellent father to them. He cared for them with all the tenderness of his once devoted heart. Sally, realizing that she would not find a better man after her late husband, gladly accepted Thomas's proposal when he asked her to be his wife. In addition, she had already fallen deeply in love with him herself. Their wedding was just a logical continuation of that quiet but so real and sincere relationship. Kevin, having eventually successfully trained as a nurse, became a great partner for Thomas himself. The men traveled together on all calls, not only as relatives, but as the best and most effective colleagues in the entire hospital. Even the head physician was surprised, admitting that he could never have expected such significant success from the formerly homeless man. As for Henry, he was eventually fired, asking him to resign. He was whining too much and working too little. At the same time, he considered himself almost the main sufferer in the entire clinic, undeservedly neglected the day he almost threatened the health of Sally, and amazing laziness and slowness. 6 months later, Sally gave her husband and brother the good news. She was expecting a baby again, but now she hoped it would be another girl. Sam turned out to be a very noisy and frisky little boy. Sally and I wanted a little more peace and quiet in the house. Her dream came true in due time. She gave birth to a healthy daughter, surprisingly similar to Thomas, with her eyes and her soft curls, her hair like hair in Kevin. Sally named the baby girl Nicole,